Right. So this presentation is called Concord's Heroes, the U.S. Colored Troop Veterans of Concord Township. So just introductions to start. So Pam Cawood Rizzo is a Concord Township Historical Society board member and independent researcher. Pam conducted all of the Concord USCT research in this presentation over the course of a year. Ms. Rizzo collected information about the veterans' service records, post-Civil War jobs, residential records, and family records from various primary sources, including federal census records, Civil War casualty sheets, and U.S. colored troop descriptive list, volunteer enlistment list, and Delaware County titles and deeds. Ms. Rizzo's work represents the first compilation of Concord Township USCT veterans and their related information and is now held in the Concord Township Historical Society archives. The Concord Township Historical Society was formed in 1967. It is a nonprofit volunteer organization and open to the public. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and share our local history. The key areas of interest and associated purposes of the society are collections, research, museum, building and grounds, membership, public relations, fundraising, and education. CTHS maintains a public museum, the Pierce Willits House on Smithbridge Road. And I'm seeing that we have a couple of last minute people coming in to, let me see if I can admit them quickly. Apologies, guys. All right. Back into. So for our newcomers, we just went through introductions about Pam Cawood Rizzo, who compiled all of this research about the Concord Township USCT veterans and for the Historical Society. So let me move this out of the way. All right, and we will launch into it. So just as a recap and to set the context for this presentation, we are going to review some general history about the American Civil War. So the American Civil War occurred between April 12, 1861 and the spring of 1865 between the North, also called the Union, and the South, also called the Confederate States of America. Many events led up to the American Civil War, but slavery was the main issue that divided the nation. Civil War historian and Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Battle Cry of Freedom, the Civil War Era, James McPherson, argues in his book that the war was caused by uncompromising differences between the free and slave states over the power of national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states. After Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States, South Carolina seceded from the Union in January 1861, followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The Confederate States of America included these states and 4 others, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, to make up 11 states total. The American Civil War had 50 significant battles and 10,500 engagements across the continental United States from Vermont to the New Mexico Territory. However, much of the fighting took place in Virginia and Tennessee. The death toll was enormous. Over 625,000 Americans perished in or from the war. Of course, the Union won the war and slavery was ultimately ended. Union victory upheld that the nation was indivisible with the sovereign national government. The American Civil War was the largest and most destructive war in the Western world from the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 to the onset of World War I in 1914. And I apologize, I am just going to admit one last person. Apologies. Okay, so an overview of the U.S. colored troops. Although African American men fought for the United States during the American Revolution and in the War of 1812, a federal law dating from 1792 barred Black men from bearing arms for the U.S. Army. However, the American Civil War caused the Union government to reconsider this ban in 1862 due to the rapidly declining number of white volunteers and the escalating number of available former enslaved men. On July 17, 1862, Congress passed the Second Confiscation and Militia Act, freeing enslaved people who had masters in the Confederate Army. The Bureau of Colored Troops was established on May 22, 1863, by the War Department's General Order Number 143. At first, recruitment was slow and enlistment numbers were low, but soon more African American men began to enlist after the public encouragement of black leaders such as Frederick Douglass, who encouraged men to become soldiers. Once in the military, black soldiers served in numerous roles and positions. According to the National Archives, black soldiers fought in artillery and infantry units and performed all non-combat support functions that sustained the Army. Black carpenters, chaplains, cooks, guards, laborers, nurses, scouts, spies, steamboat pilots, surgeons, and teamsters contributed to the war effort. There were nearly 80 black commissioned officers. Black women also served essential roles in the war. While these women could not formally join the Army, they served as nurses, spies, and scouts. Approximately 179,000 black men served as soldiers in the Union Army, and 19,000 black men served in the Navy. 10% of the Union Army were African American soldiers. 40,000 members of the United States colored troops died in service to their country. That translates to 1 in 5 men who enlisted in the USCTs. Of those deaths, 75% were caused by infection or disease. This photograph is of Army Teamsters in Cobb Hill, Virginia in 1864. And this photograph is a snippet of the General Order Number 143, which created the U.S. Colored Troops on May 22nd, 1863.
So, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is a very important part of the story of the U.S. Colored Troops. As some of you may know, he was born a slave in nearby Talbot County, Maryland, and escaped from slavery in 1838, married, and moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And I'm sure many people know that Douglass is famous for being a fierce abolitionist, for his speeches and writings against slavery. He was also very instrumental in encouraging black men to fight for the Union, as you can see from this quote on the slide. Who would be free themselves must strike the blow. In addition to his recruitment efforts, both his sons Lewis and Charles Douglass served in the Civil War in the U.S. Colored Troops. Another important quote from him. Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letter, U.S. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. There is no power on earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship.
This photograph is a Civil War recruitment letter aimed at black men, detailing the establishment of the colored troops and encouraging black men to fight for the Union.
The 54th Massachusetts Regiment. So I'm betting many of you may be wondering why we're talking about Massachusetts when we're sitting here in Pennsylvania. However, the 54th Massachusetts was very important, both in the broader context of the story of the colored troops during the Civil War and locally because we had Concord representation in the 54th Massachusetts. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was the very first unit of black soldiers in the Civil War. Massachusetts Governor John Andrew was an abolitionist, and he was pivotal in creating this unit, which began recruitment efforts in February of 1863. Although a Massachusetts regiment, you may be surprised to know that there were actually more men from Pennsylvania who enlisted in the 54th than from anywhere else in the Union. And as you may know or have heard, all the officers in charge of black troops were white. As this poster shows, the 54th was led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who was a white man. So the Massachusetts 54th, after their training was completed, the 54th was sent down to South Carolina, where they faced the Confederates at the Battle of Grimball's Landing on James Island. This map from the Library of Congress shows the importance of James Island to the Confederates for defending Charleston Harbor. The Battle of Grimmel's Landing was the first engagement for the 54th and where they first proved themselves in battle, successfully repelling Confederate advances several times and allowing another wearied Union troop to withdraw. The Battle of Fort Wagner, a few days later. Having now proven that they could fight, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment was chosen to lead the charge on Confederate Fort Wagner a few days later. Unfortunately, due to miscalculations by the Union generals, Union forces were greatly outnumbered by Confederates, and Fort Wagner did not fall. The ensuing battle was a disaster for the Union effort. This picture demonstrates the courage exhibited by the 54th in the face of terrible adversity, scaling the parapets of the fort to continue the fight with bayonets. The battle also marks the first time that an all-black troop fought alongside white troops. Harriet Tubman, who's one of the spies for the Union troops, reportedly witnessed this battle from afar. So despite the bravery, the battle for Fort Wagner was bloody. Union losses were very heavy. One assessment of the estimated casualties showed that almost 90% of those killed, wounded, and captured were Union troops. Lewis Douglas, son of Frederick, wrote the following in a letter. Saturday night, we made the most desperate charge of the war on Fort Wagner, losing in killed, wounded, and missing in the assault 300 of our men. The splendid 54th is cut to pieces. If I have another opportunity tonight, I will write more fully. Goodbye to all. If I die tonight, I will not die a coward. So the Battle of Fort Wagner was indeed a major turning point in the history of the U.S. colored troops. While the battle ended in defeat for the Union, the brave performance of the 54th was pivotal in winning the support of the military and of the public. With this battle, the 54th Massachusetts had proven that Black men could be soldiers, that they could fight for themselves and for their country. Some of you may be aware that the 1989 movie Glory, which starred Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington, told the story of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment at the Battle of Fort Wagner. It was a fictionalized account of the events. In other words, it wasn't totally historically accurate, but it brought the story of the Massachusetts 54th to a larger audience. I never learned about this in school, and I'm sure many others did not either. It also won 3 Academy Awards. This photo is from the National Park Service, shows part of the memorial sculpture in Boston to the 54th and to their leader, Robert Gould Shaw, who fell in battle. I love this photo because the grit and the determination on the faces of these men is so clear and evident. It's just beautiful.
So the U.S. colored troops and racial discrimination. African American men courageously fought for their country and died for their country long before they had equal rights as U.S. citizens and faced a tremendous amount of racial discrimination during the war. All USCT regiments were commanded by white commissioned officers, supported by black non-commissioned officers. Black soldiers were paid less than their white counterparts. The Militia Act of 1862 set pay for black soldiers at $10 a month and deducted $3 for their uniform, while white soldiers received $13 per month and did not pay a clothing deduction. This policy remained in effect until June 1864. The Confederate Army was particularly brutal and discriminatory towards black soldiers. In 1863, the Confederate Congress threatened to enslave any black soldier captured as a prisoner of war. In fact, some Confederate troops massacred 200 USCT soldiers who surrendered following the Battle of Fort Pillow on April 12, 1864, because these Confederate troops did not recognize the USCT soldiers as legitimate prisoners of war. Even in death, black soldiers still faced discriminatory practices and were often buried in segregated cemeteries. So the USCTs in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a key state in USCT history during the American Civil War. More USCT veterans came from Pennsylvania than any other northern state. 8,616 soldiers out of 180,000 American U.S. colored troops veterans came from Pennsylvania. Camp William Penn was an important training ground for Black men who entered the service from Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. The camp operated from 1863 to 1865 in present-day Cheltenham Township outside of Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, outside of Philadelphia. The area was already established as an abolitionist Quaker stronghold. It was the largest of the training camps organized for the USCTs. 11,000 Black Civil War soldiers would be organized, trained, and mustered into service at the camp. German immigrant Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wagner was assigned command of the post at his special request. After the war, veterans of the USCTs who survived the war returned to Pennsylvania, seeking job opportunities. Many other African Americans and veterans from southern states also relocated to Pennsylvania, seeking better opportunities for themselves. And I apologize, I'm just going to pause this for a moment and admit everyone to the waiting room, from the waiting room. All right, so this is a lithography of Camp William Penn.
Another photo of Camp William Penn, one that looks very different, obviously, from the ones you have just seen. So the aerial photo on the left shows, on the right, shows Camp William Penn as it is today, which is part of the North Philadelphia suburb known as Lamont. The yellow star, which hopefully you can see in the middle of that aerial photo, shows them where the location of this marker is on the right. I'd like to take a moment to kind of shout out about a website that is created by the Citizens for the Restoration of Historical Lamont. They have so much information about Camp William Penn and about all of the men who served in the regiments that were trained there. If anybody has an interest, I would strongly encourage you to visit their website at www.usct.org. That all of the information they have there is free and accessible to anyone, unlike going to Ancestry or something like that, where you have to have a membership. So a wonderful resource. Moving on to the men from Concord who served with the U.S. colored troops. In the next few slides, we're going to begin to introduce you to some of these men who served from Concord. Before we start, please understand that this is a work in progress. We know there well may be other men from the area who served, men whose stories that we were not able to uncover. Our research is ongoing, and we welcome any information you may have for us that you'd be willing to share about any men that we do not feature and the events that they took part in. Please, we would love to add new information to our archives. This slide provides a summary of the men that we know of today. 12 men who served and at least 3 more who were registered for the draft but didn't end up being called up. Some of these men spent their entire lives in Concord Townships. Others were here much more briefly. They ranged in age from 19 to 42. Many were farm workers, but 2 worked in the restaurant business. 1 was a shoemaker, and 1 later became a preacher. So we have a wide variety of men who helped serve their country. The next few slides highlight these men and their experiences. Some of them we know a lot about. For others, the records may have been lost or unavailable, limiting what we know and what we're able to tell you. So we're featuring a few that we know more about. The first of these is Lemuel Blakes, who represented Concord Township in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. Lemuel is believed to be a brother of fellow veteran Joshua Blakes, although this hasn't been proven. Lemuel traveled to James Island in South Carolina with the rest of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, where he had the misfortune to be taken prisoner by the Confederate Army in July of 1863 during the Battle of Grimble's Landing that I described earlier. So the photo on the right is of a muster roll for September and October of that year. The writing isn't easy to make out, but under remarks, it states, dropped from the rolls August 30th, 63 as missing in action, since ascertained to be a prisoner of war in the hands of the enemy. Held at Andersonville and survived. That really says it all. These words came from the National Park Service descriptive data for Lemuel Blakes. National Park Service maintains a database that contains the general profiles of many Civil War soldiers, plus those who were taken prisoner. Andersonville Prison, many of you know, it was known to have been one of, if the not worst, of the Confederate prison camps. The conditions were absolutely brutal, and many of those who were held there did not survive. Lemuel Blakes was held there for over 2 years. He was eventually freed in a prisoner exchange and was sent right back to his unit, believe it or not. This photo from the National Park Service shows the overcrowded conditions at Andersonville. It was taken from the West Wall in August of 1864, so it was taken during the time that Lemuel was there. Andersonville was located in Andersonville, Georgia. It was originally built to house 10,000 men. It eventually held 3 times that population. The conditions there were so horrific. Prisoners faced starvation and rampant disease because of the unsanitary conditions. By the end of the Civil War, it is estimated that nearly 1/3 of the prisoners that had been held there had died due to the horrible conditions. Despite the terrible hardship Lemuel Blakes endured, he was lucky. He did survive, and he returned home to Concord when his service was completed. Charles Laws is the next veteran I want to talk about. We don't have a lot of information beyond Charles, beyond what is documented in his military record. We do know that in 1850, he was living in the Concord household of January and Lydia Ann Washington. Charles Laws was enlisted in March of '84 when he was 38 years old. He served in Company B of the 43rd Regiment. Unfortunately, Charles did not return home from the Civil War, having been killed in action later that year. On the descriptive book pictured on the right, it states, under remarks, died in field hospital near Petersburg, Virginia, August 6, 1864, of wounds received July 30th, '64, in action. A good soldier. His loss was very much lamented by the men he worked with and served with. It's heartbreaking to read that to me. Following his training at Camp William Penn, Charles Laws had accompanied the 43rd Regiment to Petersburg, Virginia. Union forces desired to capture Petersburg because it was very important in the supply line to Richmond, Virginia. Outnumbered, they instead had instigated a siege of Petersburg about 2 months before the 43rd got there. This photo shows one of the Union generals, Edward Ferrero, and his staff. When the siege of Petersburg and all the related battles had concluded many months later, many of the white men in charge of the U.S. colored troops stationed there, including Ferrero, were charged with incompetence. Some of them were even accused of being drunk while the battles were going on. The Battle of the Crater. This is a story that just amazes me. In a desperate bid to end the siege of Petersburg, it was the Pennsylvania coal miners fighting for the Union under General Burnside who came up with the idea of building a tunnel under the Confederate fort known as Elliott's Salient and blowing it up. This plan was so crazy, I've actually seen this featured on TV. It is just amazing that anybody came up with this plan, let alone approved it. But it was approved. It took a month to build this tunnel underneath the Confederate fort, and I just don't understand how on earth nobody noticed what was going on while they were doing it. The Confederates apparently did not notice that anybody was building a tunnel underneath them. But once built, the mine at the end of the tunnel that you can see there was packed with 8,000 pounds of gunpowder. The first time the fuse was lit, it went out. They sat there and waited, and finally 2 brave souls crept back down that tunnel and relit the fuse, and causing the explosion. So while the explosion underneath the fort did destroy it entirely, the lack of leadership on the Union side, the drunken generals, etc., turned the whole affair into a disaster. Following the explosion, the Union commanders sent several U.S. colored troops, including the 43rd, forward into the giant crater that was created by the huge explosion. Union leadership miscalculated the number of Confederate troops that were there. Although a total of 278 men were killed in the explosion, many more Confederate troops had survived. When the Union troops were forced forward into the crater, they ended up being surrounded on all sides by the Confederates. And they were just sitting ducks that got picked off. It was horrible. The result was a bloodbath for the Union troops. Several of the generals ended up being relieved of their command, I believe, after this affair was over with, including General Burnside. Charles Laws was not among those who went forward into the crater. He was wounded at one of the ancillary battles that broke out nearby immediately following the explosion. He ended up being wounded on Cemetery Hill, which is the informal name for the nearby cemetery around Blandford Church. So this photo shows the crater not long after the event. You can see one lone soldier sitting there quietly. I can't imagine what that man must be feeling and experiencing sitting there. The destruction this explosion caused is very evident here. So this is the story that few people hear about. It's the fight for those family members who were left behind to survive after the man who was at war was killed. We know from the military records that are available that Charles Laws was married and that he and his wife, Anna, had 2 daughters at the time that he was enlisted. They had had 2 other children who had died in infancy. After Charles' death, Anna had to fight for another 2 years before she was granted a widow's pension of $8. By the time that pension was finally approved, she had already remarried, and they forced her to return some of that money. It took another 2 years before she was able to secure a minor's pension for the 2 daughters. They received another $2 a month until the time the girls reached the age of 16. Presumably, they assumed that the children should be self-supporting by that time. The pension records show many numerous exchanges between Anna and the pension officers during this time. Anna lacked documentation of her marriage to Charles and the birth of their daughters, not at all uncommon during that time, especially for Black people. Her friends were forced to come and testify many times to their marriage and to the birth of the children. Additional problems were caused because people helping Anna fill out forms misspelled one of the girls' names. Eventually, the pensions were granted, but Anna had to engage the service of attorney to assist, something that undoubtedly many widows could not do. So the next people we're going to talk about are the Derrys of Concord. We're featuring them because so many of the Derry family served their country during the Civil War. The Derry family all came from Dover Hundred in Kent County, Delaware. 6 of 7 brothers relocated to Concord prior to the Civil War: Robert, Samuel, Wilson, Benjamin, Joseph, and Thomas Derry, along with their sister, Mary Elizabeth Derry. This excerpt of a 1959 map of Kent County, Delaware, shows S. Derry living adjacent to an African Methodist Episcopal church. That church was later known as Lockwood AME. This is important since the Derrys had a close association with the Lockwood family. Census records show that some of the Lockwoods lived in their house. This church still exists and is now known as Emmanuel AME. So this slide shows the service that the Derry family provided during the U.S. Civil War. Out of the 6 brothers, 3 of those brothers served in the U.S. colored troops. 2 others were drafted only. Additionally, their sister, Mary Elizabeth, married a U.S. colored troops veteran, Solomon Dean, from Aston. Robert Derry, who was drafted but did not serve, probably due to his age. His son, George, did serve in the U.S. colored troops, and his daughter, Mary Ann, married another veteran, Benjamin Taylor. Unfortunately, we do not know anything about Benjamin's service. We cannot find any of his service records. He is shown on the 1890 U.S. Veteran Census, but that is it. Lastly, their cousin by marriage, Cyrus Burton, also served in the U.S. colored troops. In this family, one family in Concord, A total of 5 men served in the U.S. colored troops. 2 more were drafted, but not called, and 2 daughters were married to veterans, illustrating the sacrifice that one family was willing to make for their country. After the war, we did have veterans who returned to Concord and made Concord their home, or continued to keep Concord as their home. So veteran Cyrus Burton and his cousin by marriage, Joseph Derry, they returned and they built this house around 1872. It's a double house, meaning, it's a dual family house with Joseph and his wife Susanna on one side and Cyrus and his wife Charlotte on the other side. William Spriggs also came home, and immediately after returning from the war, he purchased this house from the father of 2 other veterans, Robert Elsey Jr. and William Elsey. This photo shows the house much enlarged, since the time that it was built by Robert Elsey. And it's been remodeled again since this photograph was taken, but it's located on Smithbridge Road. At this point, we'd like to take the time to give you the full list of veterans that we know about in alphabetical order, along with their units, the length of service, whether or not they were wounded, and a little bit of information about them. At this point, I'm going to stop talking and allow you to read about each of the soldiers. As you do, please remember that the information available here varies tremendously. Some men we know very little about. Others we were able to learn much more. On the second slide, you can see here are the members of the Jerry family who served. Here's our final slide describing our veterans. Just to let you know, we have printed out the descriptive list for each man, and we hope to have those lists on display at Spring Valley AME Church at some point in the future. So now that you've had an opportunity to learn about each of these veterans, we'd like to come back and full circle and link them to the community that they lived in and that we live in. This is a photo of Spring Valley AME Church on Spring Valley Road in Concord, well beloved by so many in the community. The founding trustees of Spring Valley Church included veteran Lemuel H. Blakes, Benjamin Derry, who was the brother of veterans Joseph, Samuel, and Wilson Derry, Prince Bolden, the brother of veteran Perry Bolden. Many more members of the Derry family were worshipers here over the year, and we have no doubt that family members of other men did as well. Another important link to the community, Thornbury AME Church in Thornbury. Thornbury happens to be the final resting place of many, many men who served in the U.S. colored troops all around the area. Buried here from Concord are veterans Lemuel H. Blakes, Cyrus Burton, George Derry, as well as Solomon Dean, the husband of Mary Elizabeth Derry. Many other members of the Derry family and others from Concord rest here as well. This beautiful photo is of Lemuel Blake's gravestone at Thornbury, along with the American flag that documents his service to his country. Thank you.
This is just a brief outline of some of the sources that Pam and I referred to when pulling this information together. And I just wanted to say thank you all for attending our Zoom presentation this afternoon. Again, we apologize for moving it to a virtual platform. as we had originally hoped to have it at Spring Valley AME. But due to the weather, there was a need to bring it to Zoom. I personally want to thank Pam Rizzo for thoroughly researching these veterans and some of their stories and presenting these stories to us. And thank you to the Concord Township Historical Society and Concord Township for promoting this lecture to their members.